I'd like to start by going back to your first recollection of having met Walter Hardwick.
Well, as far as I can remember, and I thought about it the other day, Walter had just come to UBC. He had not yet finished his PhD, and his interest in urban affairs, of course, was our common interest. It must have been in the middle 60s. And Lou Robinson put us together, of course. Lou was the man who brought Walter back, and Lou knew my history. In fact, Lou was a very important part of my original start in urban issues, and Walter was the next one. So it was somewhere in the middle 60s, although my dates are slightly hazy. It was certainly, as Walter came back to teach, that we began to be really interested in each other's interests in the city.
And at the time you were teaching in the planning department?
Oh yes, yes, I've been here for a long time.
And how was it that you ended up in Vancouver at the planning department?
Because they offered me a job at UBC.
Okay, well, we won't go down that road then.
Well, you can, public property, but the answer is yes. I came to UBC to teach, and Larry McKenzie was a wonderful guide in those days when he was president. So I owe it a great deal to him.
Now, in the early times when you first met Walter, what projects did you collaborate on in the earliest times?
Well, obviously, it rotated around Vancouver and its expansion and development in the 60s, and its early start with what's called the planning department, because until about the, well, let's see, 1959, there was no such thing. In this city, the history of planning is actually quite fascinating. It goes back to the Town Planning Commission, which launched the first zoning bylaw in 26-27 with the help of Harlan Bartholomew. And his notion was a plan, e.g. a document, to be managed by the Town Planning Commission, which had at the beginning one and then ultimately two staff people. And they're wonderful people. Sandy Walker was the Secretary General of the Commission for, I don't know, 15 years. And I served on the Commission for almost 10 years. So in a sense, it was around the changing circumstances, namely there was now going to be a full-time planning department in those days under Sutton Brown, who ultimately became Bête Noire. But it was issues dealing with the planning of the city of Vancouver. I can't remember now what aspect. Obviously, it soon became the central issue was transportation.
Now, Bartholomew's plan was based on a concentric ring model for zoning in the city.
Well, all right. I mean, there are two plans. Bartholomew was here twice. Bartholomew was here in 26, 27, and then again in 48. So it depends which plan you're talking about. He has done Vancouver twice, 20 years apart.
Well, my understanding was that the concentric ring model, which was superimposed over the city, starting with the central business district, which was the edge of the peninsula, that then went outwards and created the zone eventually, which was the industrial zone going from Falls Creek and around to Burrard Inlet. But of course, that works fine on the prairies and flatlands, but not particularly well if you've got an irregular shaped coastline.
No, I think you're right. I think the basic impact of Bartholomew was not that. It was really the grid system of the roads, because what we today call Vancouver, half of it was not developed. You know, when I came here, it was bush from about 41st on up. So there was a great deal of undeveloped, uncharted land, which ultimately was used in the 50 to roughly 68 period. And it was city land, because a great deal of the actual land had reverted to City Hall for taxes in the hungry 30s. So the big impact of Bartholomew was the grid system, which simply allowed the land which the city had inherited because of tax default to be retailed. And that happened in the 50s and early 60s.
Now, earlier on, that would have coincided with the layout of the old streetcar system.
Right. In fact, Bartholomew built on it, no question about it, sure. I still use the streetcar, so I know something about it. And the interurban, by the way, to New Westminster, which is another major transportation link.
Somewhere there's, Dad had some old footage of just someone got on the back of one of the streetcars with a moving camera and
Really?
just shot endlessly.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Be fascinating. What year would that be?
Well, it was still largely bush, so I would have thought, well,
Let's
it's
see.
not in the 30s,
And
thereabouts. I'm not sure, it could have even been in the late 20s.
really? Well,
Well, it was what,
fascinating.
28 was when Kerrisdale amalgamated with the city, so there was a
Yes,
big.
yeah,
Mhm.
and Point Grey, yeah.
So it was into an evolving city that your relationship with Dad first came into being.
And teaching what I now call planning at the university level, which was not exactly a straightforward line. UBC was the first in Canada to actually teach planning at a university level, and certainly at what I would call postgraduate level. So Walter was very important to us and to me, and we to each other ultimately, in fostering an academic and ultimately professional framework of education at UBC.
What were the hot spots at that time in the mid-60s that you first started to examine in the city's development?
Well, I think the first really was the transformation of the West End, an extraordinary transformation. In other words, what happened, as you know, is new wine into old bottles. These old lots at the West End it was a very fine residential area, which suddenly was transformed into a much higher density, multiple housing unit, and that was an all-consuming process. What was interesting that almost at the same time, or a little later, the same thing was proposed for Shaughnessy, which is sometimes forgotten, because that was clearly another old residential area which had deteriorated to some degree because during the war, Shaughnessy particularly was a favorite boarding house area. I don't know whether you've checked into that, but a great number of the now fancy houses, which have been modeled and remodeled, were actually boarding and rooming houses between 1940 and 48. In fact, the old debate about illegal suites, which is still with us, all started in Shaughnessy. So that was part of the dynamics, the transformation of the old residential areas, the West End to start with, then the possibility, which fortunately did not happen, of Shaughnessy, and in between, of course, the false Fairview slopes. The change there from single-family residential area into a much more dense area, but it did not go all the way to the West End model. So the dynamics of that transformation of that inner ring of residential area was fascinating to us and to my students. In other words, my interest was really to teach by example, and from the very beginning our students went out and actually attempted to A, understand, and B, solve real urban situations. So our students were all over Falls Creek and the Fairview Slopes and the West End, and trying to understand how these changes would affect the character and nature of the city.
Well, the West End was an interesting combination of the large parcels of land that had large houses on it that could be consolidated for high-rise development, coupled with the old streetcar lines. It was quite well defined as a neighborhood. You didn't have to go further than Davie to Denman down to be able to have the kind of commercial development on the streets, and then behind it the increasingly dense residential high-rise development.
Yes, the big question really was the street system, because as I said, it turned out to be new wine into old bottles. The street system was never designed for what it now has to carry, and the result is, you know, all these traffic stoppers and traffic delay bumpers and circles and so on introduced to discourage through traffic. But historically, and we debated that, and I think your father was part of it with Sutton Broad at the time, actually try and change the grid system by closing certain streets and putting into motion a kind of system of access, which is different from circulation. And that didn't happen because we still have, you know, basically the old grid system of lots constraining the rational development. Yes, you're right. It was able, some were able to assemble larger components, but many did not. So the road system was the one that we particularly wanted to change.
In contrast with the other major Western North American cities developing, particularly Los Angeles, but also Seattle on a much smaller scale, the development of the freeways and the emphasis on automobile culture was a major impact on the thinking of planners at that time. And yet you were looking in the West End at densification around an old grid system and an old streetcar route. Was that the thinking with Gerald Sutton Brown and others at the time, that Vancouver should adapt itself to the automobile culture in similar form to the American cities?
The quick answer is yes. It wasn't so much a question of adaptation, but taking advantage of certain both political, social trends and financial support. See, this is the time when we built the Trans-Canada Highway system. And the question is, what will happen when it comes to Vancouver? How will it serve us? How can you accommodate the impact on the city? And how will it go on, in theory at least, from here across to Victoria? So just like the US national highway system, which, you know, really transformed the US radically in the 50s, we were about to receive the Trans-Canada Highway. So the big question really was how to deal with the Trans-Canada once it hits our boundary. We couldn't know much about beyond that. So the question was what to do and how to make it come in and disgorge the great traffic. And of course we argued that we didn't really need it. The disastrous model of the impact of what would happen was all before us in Seattle and of course in LA, but you must connect that to the Trans-Canada Highway and the potential impact it had on the street system.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you discovered or unearthed this plan to bring the freeway in through what is now Gastown and downtown Eastside?
It wasn't that difficult because well, the Planning Commission discussed this.
Which you were sitting on.
That's right, yeah, very much so. And it also was, in a sense, public knowledge. I don't mean the whole scheme, such as it was, perhaps, but the immediate resolution of certain things. The Venerable corridor, you know, became a big issue. In fact, it was bits and pieces rather than the total scheme. And we tried to prevent certain things from happening, but Sutton Brown was convinced that he had the right solution, and he relied entirely on US engineering advice. And that's really where it all started. The engineers whom he brought in varying ways, following Bartholomew, I mean, this whole tradition of US consulting advice came from LA and from the freeway system, which was then full steam, and ultimately the model that consumes Seattle. So the question was, how can we become like them and therefore deal with the opportunities that this presented, and also the bringing Vancouver into the 20th century, that kind of idea.
Were you present at the so-called Great Freeway Debate at City
Oh
Hall?
God, yes, I certainly was. I was chairman of the Planning Commission. In fact, if you go back to the archives, you can see me in glorious Technicolor. No, it was very simple because in those days, the Commission really had a role to play in various specific City Hall decisions, bylaws, and their acceptance or their defeat at City Hall. And we tried very hard to advise City Council as an independent unit, really, that the impact of the freeway system would be quite disastrous. But it was very difficult because A. Sutton Brown had this whole engineering machinery behind him, and City Hall bureaucracy was very strong and had a tremendous influence on City Council. You know, Mayor Campbell, if you remember that name, Tom, you know, was out there very much in support of the freeway and boosterism. That's what it was. I mean, it was an extraordinary opportunity of making Canada and making British Columbia and making Vancouver kind of part of the North American culture. The Planning Commission was not at all unanimous, so we debated this at great length. And ultimately, I don't know whether you remember that, but it's certainly part of the record, it came to a public hearing at John Oliver High School, at which I presented the Commission's view and then resigned publicly. And that really set the process in motion. It was after that that all the political machinery came to bear upon that decision. And Walter was there, of course, and everybody else. Out of that came a team. Without that, it probably wouldn't have started right at that moment anyway.
Obviously, Sutton Brown and Tom Campbell, and coming out of the age of W.A.C. Bennett, had a very definite boosterism kind of approach to the development of Vancouver and the hub in British Columbia. Where the counterpoint to that, the opposition that grew and became team, where did the vision come, the competing vision for Vancouver come from?
I don't know whether it's one single source or even one single vision or even one very clear vision at the time. It was obvious that the freeway proposal would drastically affect Vancouver in very simple ways. It would cut us off from our birthright, which was the water. Very important. This was terribly critical, and once and for all, it would deny us access, which already was difficult, because the Port Authority and all the other industrial uses had already preempted access. So that free would have destroyed any opportunity of real water access. And the second thing was that it would have destroyed the essential neighborhoods through which it would rush through, you know, the East End and of course ultimately Chinatown. But it was those two things. And then the question really was what to do with the result of all the cars. You know, where do you put them once they're downtown? And there wasn't any clear idea as to link that to land use. Yes, we had zoning, but that was different in a sense from the ultimate use of the downtown peninsula. And the model, of course, was that it should be a what's the word? Your father tried to make me understand this many times. CBD, and how that would grow, and whether this would be, you know, high rise or in some other way. So the question really was how to prevent this from happening, and the water access was very central to this issue, both in the West End and in the downtown core and Chinatown and what is now all the rest of the East Side. But I think it's important to remember that it was a hotly debated issue. There was, you know, no clear-cut. Yes, there was a vision, but the vision was really, in a sense, a simple thing. It wasn't, as I remember it, some grand scheme. Now, there were various competing visions. 1958, Erickson and four of us got together and developed a vision for the West End. I don't know if you've ever seen that. That was called Group 58, and there were 5 of us, and who actually sat down and drew what we thought the West End could be like in this process of transition, of transformation. And the drawings are still there, and Arthur is still very proud of that. Would that vision have gone through? I'm not sure whether the results would have been all that spectacular, but it would have in fact addressed the question of the grid system, because we said at the time that transforming just the zoning without changing the access pattern and the grid allocation of lots just doesn't work. So that was our basic point, 58. So there were many attempts by interested groups, architects, engineers, all kinds of people, certainly the Board of Trade and people around that group of businessmen, of how it could become, you know, a much more important metropolis than it was. Vancouver was a small town until certainly the end of the 60s. So the vision changed over time and was the result of enormous public debates. I mean, this is the Planning Commission played an important role, the Board of Trade played an important role, and ultimately the political system, because after the public hearing at John Oliver, it was obvious that it had to become a political issue, a local party political issue. And by party I mean an actual issue around which people would stand for office at City Council, and that's when Walter moved into running for City Council, and I went to run for school board, which was very important to us. And of course, if you remember, the first success of team was that we swept the school board, and that was both an important point of attack, counter-attack, and training. You know, Fritz Bowers and I topped the polls at the school board, and I was its chairman for 2 years. And that was a political platform from which we then began to organize, so it turned out to be a two-attempt capturing City Council. Without the initial success in Parkswood, we wouldn't have made it.
That was in 1968.
That's right.
That was when Dad was first elected as
That's
alderman.
correct. Yeah.
And then Mr. Phillips got in on the recount.
That's right, and he was the first in, and I was the first in on the town plan, on the school board.
Do you remember who was involved in the initial setup of team, the core group?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, some of it happened right here, actually in our old house. There's one person particularly is significant, which has been like kind of lost. I think I mentioned to you the other day, Elsa Larson. Is that a name that you remember at all? Mm-hmm. In fact, I was quite impressed to find quite recently that now the Parks Board actually set aside a wonderful spot on Kitsilano Beach called Elsa's Point.
Yes, no, I walk down there all the time.
That's right. Well, that's a woman that deserves a lot of credit, together with you know, all kinds of other people around the table, and most of the names are still around. I'm trying to remember, it was the mayor of New Westminster, no, the mayor of West Vancouver, which was a wonderful guy, who in fact is a lawyer, and he incorporated us, and he invented the word team. In other words, what is the name of the wonderful guy? It's in my records. Oh, he was a very robust and well-regarded local politician, ultimately served on Canada Post. It'll come to me. Anyway, he was a very important point, because while we had enthusiasm around the table, the mechanics, like incorporating and creating a legal entity called the Team Electors Action Movement, you know, wasn't something you do overnight unless you know how to do this. And he was the one who knew how to do it, and he took us, and we paid some money, and he incorporated us, and he created then this thing called Team by, you know, bringing together what was a very awkward collection of words. But the word team obviously worked, so that was his contribution. And there were several others. I have to go back and actually unearth some of the names who at the time were very central to the idea of, and the idea was very simple. It had to become a part of political issue. It couldn't go on as a kind of side issue amongst other public events. And it had to get enough people around it who would actually run on the platform, and therefore, for the first time in Vancouver, actually launch a civic party with a platform. I mean, up until 1968, everybody ran on, I'm a good guy, look at me, don't I look wonderful, and I'll help you. But what never occurred? City Council was composed of all kinds of people, willing and able, but A, they had no coherence, no cohesion, because they didn't belong to a party, it was an NPA, and the other is they had no platform. So the important thing of team in '68 was to change that process, to make it a party political issue, to create a party, to create a platform, and to get enough people to commit to a joint policy, set of joint policies, and hang together through caucus. In other words, introduce the idea of a political system at the local level as distinct from letting it all be free-for-all.
Why didn't you run for city council?
Well, for two reasons. We had at the time decided that we ought to spread our resources and learn how to do it. You know, it's not something you do, you may be different, but in those days we wanted to learn how to do this and to set the stage for what was to come. We knew we couldn't get 11 seats or 6 or 9 or whatever it was. So it was a very deliberate choice. And your father was amongst those who said, no, we'll do this in stages. And we, in a sense, allocated each other's skills and resources. I was always interested in education for obvious reasons. And the school board was another area which had already messed up all kinds of things. And I said, no, I'd like to run. And Fritz Bowers ran with me, and one more. There were 3 of us. And we all got in. And we topped the polls. And in fact, I topped the polls to the point where I had more votes than Tom Campbell, who never forgave me for that, although he was elected as mayor. And your father got in, and then Art got in by recount. So those are the 2. And we had 3 in city council, on the Parks board, and there was somebody on the school board, and there was some on the Parks board. I've forgotten what that was. But anyway, it was sufficiently reasonable to have a caucus amongst those 3 levels of elected individuals. Another thing that never happened before. You know, the Parks board didn't talk to the school board, didn't talk to the city council. Well, now we suddenly had an opportunity of saying, all right, so what's going to be our policy on neighborhood planning, e.g. neighborhood centers, e.g. school location, e.g. after our school use? I mean, these were very real issues. And there was never an opportunity of discussing it because these 3 levels of elected officials all had their own flag to wave. So the idea of caucusing amongst city council, school board, Parks board was in itself an innovation. We would meet every other week or something, and I would read the council minutes. Never had that done before. And that was very important, so that we would each know what the rest of the system would plot. And believe me, they were all plotting, because they had all kinds of other things they wanted to do, which didn't add up.
Now, were they the other politicians or the civil servants?
Primarily the other civil servants, but the politicians were, in a sense, amiable because they had no alternatives. You know, when I've forgotten what the title was, the Stu LaFoe. Stu LaFoe was the superintendent of parks. And Stu LaFoe appeared at the Parks Board meeting with a proposal. Who was going to oppose him? He was, by definition, impressive, well qualified, well prepared. He had an attack, he had a process, he had a budget. So you're going to question that? Yes, if you have studied the minutes from previous meetings and checked with city council and with other agencies and said, well, just a minute, asked you, are you sure about this? Well, so yes, the answer to your question is public service clearly ran the machinery. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's what they're supposed to do. But the elected officials must be able to, from an informed basis, question their proposals and not merely accept because it's being presented. And that was a very important lesson we all had to learn. And it took 2 years for us to learn this. So the success, in my view,
I'm just concerned about, are we okay on the sound?
Yeah, we can't have that because we need to overpower the voices. I'll go check and see.
just tell it, lie low. Anyway, do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, of course, I'm just, I'm curious.
By the way, that lesson is still to be learned today.
I'm lost.
We're okay?
No, I thought it was that, but.
Why they think they know better?
Pardon?
Why the civil servants think they know better?
Well, that's their job, 9 to 5, not better. Look, all the elected officials, certainly at that time, at best part-time, okay? I mean, they were there for 2 or 3 meetings a week, and that was it. You know, city council didn't spend night after night reading minutes. You know, they were all businessmen that ran Nelson Laundry. You know, the guy who runs Nelson Laundry is not going to spend his time studying subject. Okay. So, in a nutshell, what happened in '68 as a result of the freeway debate was to transform, over time, city council from a simply making decisions upon the recommendation of the staff to a well-prepared, policy-oriented group of people with ultimately a majority so that they could actually act and therefore either accept or reject or modify what the public servant had proposed, and in fact ultimately, as you well know, make sure that the right public officials are in the right job. Sutton Brown had to go when the majority was there to allow this to happen. So it was clearly, it wasn't, you know, a revolt with barricades, but it was a radical change of how to do business. How to go from a essentially small scale, small town kind of notion of housekeeping to a determined, policy-based initiative of deliberate change based on consultation and debate.
Where did it shift
End of
though,
lecture.
towards a neighborhood town center approach as opposed to, okay, let's just put the suburbs here, the industrial area here. The whole notion of mixed use, which actually was quite European in tenor in many respects. When did that start to permeate the values and vision of the group?
Well, I'm not sure I can give you a direct answer, but the mixed use, of course, has been proposed or promoted for a long time. Let me introduce something else here. The city had a pretty active group of planning-oriented citizens. The Community Arts Council, very significant institution. The Community Planning Association, a very significant institution. The Housing Association of Vancouver, a significant institution. So these are all big players, but they all had certain things to contribute. The Community Planning Association of Vancouver was the main promoter of mixed use. Year upon year they would have meetings and they would bring in speakers and they would bring in debate about the opportunity of piling commercial and residential and to some degree recreational uses in the same building. Tom McDonald, he was part of this team group, for instance. Tom deserves a great deal of credit for that particular issue. He's long gone, but you know, here's another man who really has made that happened to have been his own special interest. He lived in the West End and he promoted this idea of multiple use, as we call it, rather than mixed use, and making the commercial, residential, recreational package work. Peter Stratton, another name, long forgotten. Now, without Peter, the Housing Association would never have worked. And he lived in the West End. And he, again, you know, in other words, apart from the stars that you've interviewed, there have been a lot of other people who, in their own way, managed to advanced ideas, Tom McDonald, and the multiple use. Peter Stratton, Board of Trade. He was in the Board of Trade. Every meeting I can still see him there. We need more what we now call social housing. In those days it was simply public housing. And without him, all these projects in Chinatown would never have happened.
Was he responsible in part for the notion of mixed residential from high-end commercial through social housing, like they have in Falls Creek, for example?
Yeah, but that came much later. Sure, I mean, Walter Hardwick could not have achieved what without Peter Stratton. It's very simple. A, they knew each other, and B, that was the kind of process. So that, you know, when your father championed certain things, and Philip and all the others in City Council, except Pendecourt, they were building on these elements. And, you know, it was people like Stratton and Tom McDonald who were people for City Council, and said, yes, let's do this. You know, as you will discover when you get to City Council, that you need a public support. And you're going to build that support. And there were these other people out there, like Elsa Larson, like Tom McDonald, like Peter Stratton, Peter Hebb, all kinds of people. Actually his mother. Or, here's a wonderful character, you must somehow get it there. Well, never mind. Okay, next question.
I'm still interested in the early decision to steer away from the freeways, because it anticipated, I believe, that the proliferation of automobiles just wasn't going to stop. And the fact that we could never build enough freeways, as long as there were, you know, more and more and more cars being built and the population increasing. It's interesting, to me it's self-evident, but at the time there was a different way of looking at things, especially vis-a-vis the automobile. Everybody had a two-car garage. There was much more of an emphasis on cars than there is now, but that's come out of necessity as we've dealt with densification in areas like the West End, for example. But it was, in my view, it was way ahead of its time that it should have been recognized in 1968 that there was going to be so much automobile pressure on the central business district and through the core of the city.
Well, I understand and hear what you're saying. I wonder whether your father would agree. Because I think the facts that I remember are slightly different. Out of the post-war period, ownership of car was an extraordinarily important achievement. This was not just four wheels. This was a very important status that you had achieved, and the motor car was the symbol of progress because they had fins and all kinds of other elements, and it was sold not because you can get around faster, it was sold because of the opportunity that it demonstrates that you've arrived. So the motor car was something terribly important to this emerging group of people who could afford a car, and then could afford two cars. Wow! That's very important. In other words, we're not just dealing here with the technical, but a very real social cultural elevation that made the car a very significant component of our life. Now, full stop, next paragraph. Every building in the downtown area, by bylaw, was encouraged to provide parking. You couldn't get a building permit unless you provided, on the ground floor or below, umpteen units, and they were scaled to the scale of the building. You know, if you had 2 for every square foot or 1 for every square foot, you know the basic background. So that was not a question of choice. So if you built a office building, as they did in the 50s and 60s, you had to provide these downtown parking lots. There was a conditio sine qua non. So the public policy encouraged it as well. So while you are right in saying what you've done, I think you will recognize the social cultural opportunities of the motor car, and then the push by the public domain. Today we go the other way. You know, we say don't provide parking, pay for it or something, you know. But in those days it was all to do with, in the shopping center. Anyway,
I'm interested in the larger context. Let's go back to.
do you follow what I'm trying to
I
explain?
do,
Yeah,
I do.
good.
I'm just trying to figure out how to recharacterize it for today and then contrast it to where we were in 1968, for example. From 1968 until 1972, when team took over control of
Mhm.
council, you've described it as an incremental process.
Oh, yeah.
Can you describe some of the key issues during that period of time before you took control?
Well, in a sense, sure. I can give you one more sort of example as to the discussion I had with your father many times. 68, he went to city council, and Art was there, and Fritz Bowers, and I forgot the third man, he taught math at UBC, was the school board. What was important is that actually UBC had launched half a dozen academics in the political arena. Never done before. Hadn't happened before. So there were 3 academics on the school board, 1 academic in city council, and there may have been 2 in Parks board. No, Bill Gibson, of course. Bill Gibson was in the Parks board. No, well, Bill was at the very beginning of, that's another guy. You must see Bill. I don't know who you've talked
He's in Victoria.
So, okay, so that's 67, 68, all right? So now the question is, what can we do? And what can we do to build what I call the caucus process? You know, to actually find some way of making, A, the numbers grow, and B, really build on a more rational, policy-oriented public process. What issues would really become significant? Well, things are external as well as internal. Vancouver was not the only place in Canada. This is the beginning of Trudeau. And that's not inconsequential. Because in 70, when I was scheduled to run for city council, I had an offer to go to Ottawa. And therefore I didn't run for city council. I became Deputy Minister of Urban Affairs. I had to set up a new ministry dealing with urban affairs across the country. And that was a wonderful opportunity, not only for the country in a sense, but for Vancouver to link and relate to what could become, and did become ultimately, Falls Creek. You know,
Who's the minister?
well, I had 3. It was a very important part of the dynamics. Bob Andras, whom you had never heard of, a wonderful guy. But the second one was equally critical because he was the member for Vancouver Centre, Ronnie Basford. So you had the deputy and the minister from Vancouver. So that was a pretty reasonable combination of influence. So when you talk about what projects, it was these projects that we all thought we might do and were doable. And now that I've moved to Ottawa as deputy minister for the next almost 4 years, here was an opportunity of doing things that city council here just couldn't do alone.
Now, that would have coincided with the Granville Island.
Absolutely. Without it, absolutely. I've got the documents to prove it. So the point is, you've got to see it in the context of a much larger political change. And the Trudeau era was a very important part of the change, in my view.
Now, you said there were, just out of interest, you said there were 3 ministers, so after Ron Basford, there was a 3rd.
Yeah, sure. In fact, there were 4 ultimately, but 3. Barney Danson. I don't know, ring a bell.
Yes.
Yes. He then went on to Minister of Defense. And Ouellette was the last. You see Ouellette? Does that ring a bell?
What? But Ron Basford continued his involvement with Granville Island beyond that.
Oh, sure, because he was the local MP. But the key was that he was Minister of Urban Affairs.
Now, I know that Dad had started working on Falls Creek. His initial paper on land use economics was back in 1958.
Yeah.
But, and I assume that from 68 until they took control in 72, there, a lot of the groundwork was done so that when they swept in 72, they were able to affect the kind of wholesale changes with the land swaps and rezoning change.
Well, not only this, but they had an agenda. It wasn't just how to do it, but they had an agenda. I mean, that's the point that I try to make. Forgive me for being insistent, but it was a change in how and not just what to do. And the agenda was to have a policy platform. And the policy platform started with the paper, among others, that your father produced. State Appendix produced material, and a number of other people. Who was the man in land economics who produced? Anyway, the academy produced a lot of stuff at the time. And then these 4 or 5 people stepped up and actually ran for office, which is different from just providing information.
So in '72, when they took over council, with the majority on council, you were still in Ottawa.
That's right.
And were you out in Vancouver at the time of the election?
I was there. Yes.
I remember, I was there that night, but I was 12, so.
Well, it's all right. Perfectly okay.
Was
You're lucky you were 12. I wish I would have been 12 then.
Oh, it was so exciting.
Yeah, it's quite right. No, it was exciting because it was a culmination of about 5 years of work. And that's really terribly important. This is not something that happened overnight. And it was a fundamental change in the politics of governing the city of Vancouver. And then ultimately GBID, because, you know, these things are not unrelated. Harry Lash, you know, another guy in this whole business. So there's any number of actors, and they each have their own slot and in each contribution. I mean, I was out here as deputy many times for many, many reasons, and almost invariably I would have a chat with your father or with Art or somebody and say, you know, what are we going to do? And we would try and plot. And you know, CMHC played a very critical role. And I was the director of CMHC for 4 years. And CMHC was not exactly, what's the word, rational corporation. It was a maintenance company. So that had to be changed.
And then throughout that period, you had passing contact with Dad.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And then, weren't you in, then was Habitat after?
That came 74. That was my last hurrah, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Okay, let's start with the significant change in '68 when Trudeau became Prime Minister, because that is not inconsequential. A, locally, and B, nationally. Now, out of this came the creation of a federal Ministry of Urban Affairs. Highly controversial, against the Constitution, but essential in order to manage what had become a crucial change in Canada. Canada was no longer 10 provinces, it now had become 3 cities. And certainly what happened since then has corroborated that change with a vengeance. Now, having said this, the Constitution still claims that we are 10 provinces, which is a very archaic and unfortunate kind of construct. So, out of the notion that Canada is becoming urbanized, Trudeau and those around him said, look, we're going to do something about the enormous federal impact on the city. I don't know whether you recall, but since then and today, as we sit here, the largest single landowner in any city in this country is the federal government. The largest single employer in any given city is the federal government. That includes Victoria. So the concept that federal had nothing to do with the city is nonsense. Okay, out of this came 2 things. The Minister of State for Urban Affairs, responsible for making some sense out of the federal system on behalf of the city. The physical result, Granville Island, Falls Creek, Harbourfront in Toronto, Fletcher's Field in Montreal, Harbourfront in Halifax, and so on. But beyond that, it was clear already that the cities are a global, not a national phenomenon. I suspect that when your mother wanted to shop, she went to Seattle, not to Toronto. I know my wife goes to Seattle and not to Toronto.
No, my mom, she went to the Sears bargain basement in Burnaby.
Well, okay, but I mean, beyond that, our relationships have always been north-south. And that your father documented many times. So, part of the Ministry of Urban Affairs was to do something about Canada's relationship with the cities abroad. That's part of our mandate. It's in the document. And in 68, 69, 70, we began to see what could be done. And the only vehicle was the UN, of course. There's no point in trying to deal with the US and the rest sort of hanging in midstream. So out of this came the first UN conference on the human environment, 1972, Stockholm. I don't know whether you heard about this, a very significant event. At that time, we were lucky enough to place one of Canada's leading managers into the UN system, and that was Maurice Strong. And Maurice Strong went to Stockholm and managed the conference, and we went to Stockholm in 72 and said, all right. At the time, everybody was worried about the whales and the owls and the fish and the rocks and the water and all the good things. And we said, look, and that was our policy paper. These elements are neutral. Water is neither good nor bad. There is no pure water in the world. And, you know, fish live on each other and they consume each other, and birds eat fish and so on. I mean, it's an interlocking, interdependent system. So if you're really concerned about the degradation of the quality of the environment, water and air and land, you got to deal with the causes, and the cause is the city. So we said in 72, if you're really concerned about the city as we are, let's have a meeting on the city, not the environment. And the UN agreed to this proposal and said, okay, now you do it. And that was the beginning of the 76 meeting, not on human environment, but on human settlements. That's
Held in Vancouver by Jericho.
Well, Jericho's only half.
Yeah.
You see, Jericho was the free-for-all. We're talking about a major international meeting of 140 nations in the QE Theater. And that was a very important beginning. And now we're going on to, as you know, the World Urban Forum. So that's the lineage.
Did Dad come to be part of Habitat through
Oh
you?
yeah, sure. Oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
And,
He had no choice. What was actually most important is at this point, I was back in UBC and I tried to make sure that there would be a legacy, that there would be a continuing involvement in these processes of change and research. And that set up the UBC Center for Human Settlements, which I then ran for 15 years. That was the legacy of Habitat, still there.
were you familiar with the Urban Futures Project and
Yes.
the research that
Yeah.
Father was doing? That
Yeah.
would have been 1976, 75.
Yeah, before I went to Victoria.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was then followed up by the Choosing Our Future follow-up
That's right.
20 years later, and contributed to the Livable Region
That's right.
strategy.
That's right.
Were you involved in any of those things?
Well, do you know the, what's his first name? The director, Peter, not Peter. Lash, what was his first name? Oh, getting old. Well, GBRD was one modest pearl in a string of many activities. And the only claim that I have is in the string and in our friend Lash, who was then director, who wrote the Livable Region document. I don't know whether you've seen that, which was financed by the Ministry for Urban Affairs. So we financed that particular exercise. And that then became, you know, a document which we built. But GBRD is one of 4 manifestations of regional planning. which you may not remember. Anyway, 1950, the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board was established on the presumption that the whole river system from here to Hope had a common future, and that the river basin would be in fact a single developmental unit for geographic and historic reasons. And the Regional Planning Board spent a great deal of time developing a plan, which in fact became an official plan, one of the only official plans in this country, which had power of implementation. And that was between 53 and 58 or 59. Another component in this whole change. This is the whole point. I think there's so many things happening that to insulate or isolate one from the other is kind of doing a disservice to all of it. Anyway, out of this came then the regional plan was too powerful an instrument for the province, and they said, no, we're not going to do that again. And they dismantled it and cut the region into 3. Hence, GBRD stops at Langbeth, which makes no sense at all. And that was the result of that first attempt at really making sense out of the whole geographic region.
So historically, it's been the province that's
Oh,
emasculated
yeah.
the ability to
Yeah.
assemble
Oh, very
the
much so.
regional
That-
district.
That's, yeah, and they were always frightened. You know, look, the power of the city is enormous. To this day, God bless our present premier, you know, he knows how powerful the goddamn city is. And he's always trying to, you know, do what he can to make sure that the province stands first. It's the dynamics. Anyway, I think I've said enough.
I just, kept 2 more questions. I just, out of that, the agricultural land reserve.
Oh yeah, well, how much time have we got? No, I'm not going to cover this.
Okay,
It
okay.
makes no sense at all. Terribly important, very much part of the milieu of the day because it happened in 72.
Mhm.
Without this, you know, we would have lost 2/3 of the battle. So in a sense, the Land Commission and that invention by the NDP government of the day under Dave Barrett and Levy and all the others was very crucial. So it's, yes, you know, and they built on the knowledge and the academic material that your father and others had produced by that time. These are not unrelated subjects. You know, Bob Williams, who was the minister of the day, was a student of mine. You know, Bob was amongst the first to get a master's degree in city planning. You can take it from there. So these are not, you know, he was a student of Walter's, obviously, one way or another. So it's all there. So the commission, of course, the one thing that has survived, which is amazing. In fact, 2 things survived. One is the Land Commission, and the other is the insurance company. Nobody has challenged either of them. They've nibbled away and done all kinds of funny things, but in fact, in policy terms, this has survived governments of all stripes in the last 30 years. An amazing achievement.
In winding up, I wondered if you could say a few words specifically about Dad and what you feel that we've touched on it in many different ways, but if there was a seminal moment or something that helps wind it up for you about Walter.
All right. Before I do this, I insist that I want to get a copy of this.
Done.
For good reasons. You'll see in a minute why. Walter and I had many points of contact, many joint enterprises, many separate enterprises. We didn't always agree. We had points of debate, and he came from one side, which was highly intellectual, academic, research-based. I came from action, and to some degree we obviously complement each other, but we also had our points of difference. But there's one thing very important. When I came back to UBC from Ottawa, and the UN conference had taken place, I was determined to have a legacy, as I explained, which was the Center for Human Settlements. That Center for Human Settlements would not have happened without your father. By this time, he was Deputy Minister of Education. and we both knew what deputy ministers can do. And he was the one who was central to getting a substantial amount of money from Victoria to allow us originally to build on the campus the building to house the Center for Human Settlements. So it was a joint enterprise, federal finance, provincial finance, and to some degree UBC finance, which gave us the building, which housed the center and other things now. But the original support came from the Minister of Education, as it obviously had to, because UBC was part of the educational system. So between Pat McGeer and Walter Hardwick and 2 or 3 others, we had the good fortune of putting our case to them, and they agreed. So Walter and I worked on many things, and the building, which is still there, is part of my heritage.
Well, congratulations to you and to all of you. I'm a little jealous because, you know, I grew up at that time in the late 60s and through the 70s, and I grew up in the age of Trudeau and watched all this change and was sensitive to just that real sense of being able to create a better world. And it's become so jaded in the years since. People don't care the way that they did, or they don't seem to care the way they did at the time.
Well, can you turn that off for a moment? All